Big Bang Bar was as much, maybe more, a product of Chicago as it was Capcom's creation. To understand why, you need to understand how Chicago became the bedrock upon which pinball was built. Although pinball traces its distant ancestry back to France during the reign of King Louis XIV, and the 1871 patent of a plunger by British inventor named Montague Redgrave in Cincinnati, Ohio, the game's heart and soul is deeply rooted in Chicago's 1830s rise as a Midwest metropolis. Coin-operated games using Redgrave's plunger, known as bagatelle, and similar to pachinko games, were already popular across the country in the early 1900s, but they hadn't yet become a smash hit, at least not until 1931, when David Gottlieb started producing a game called Baffle Ball at his manufacturing plant located about 10 miles from the Chicago shores of Lake Michigan. By the end of 1932, there were more than 100 pinball manufacturers in the U.S., most of them in Chicago, firmly solidifying the Windy City as the home to pinball. By the 1970s, pinball machines looked pretty much like they do today, with plungers, flippers, bumpers, digital displays, and a host of solid-state electronics controlling it all. The decade was even home to two pinball films, 1975's Tommy and 1979's Tilt. It was the golden age of arcades in the mid-80s, awash in the I Want My MTV generation of parachute pants-wearing, Jackson-loving, quarter-popping teens, which set the stage for pinball's greatest rise and a stark collapse into near oblivion. The pinball industry first rocketed to the heights of culture-shaping popularity in the 80s. Then, with the opening of the 90s, that success staggered and began to teeter on the precipice of a financial freefall. And it was then that Capcom decided to build a studio devoted to pinball machines. A number of people with first-hand knowledge of those early Capcom coin-op days said they weren't still entirely sure why the Japanese-based company decided to invest in pinball. Several people told Polygon, where I got all this information from, and basically am doing this word for word verbatim from their article, were contacted by the company back in the 90s for advice, and all of those people, highly placed in the world of pinball design and creation, told the company it was a bad idea. But Capcom did it anyway, and its effort lasted just 18 months. The guy who convinced Capcom to get into the pinball business didn't really know what they didn't know, said George Gomez, who is currently the vice president of game development at Stern Pinball, but who at the time was designing pinball machines at Williams. They didn't understand the business. They had decided in Japan to do this, probably looking at Data East's success in pinball, Stern Pinball head Gary Stern said. They hired a lot of Williams people, whether they were unsuccessful because of their own practices or because the market had blipped and they missed the high point, I don't know. Capcom's step into the pinball world was complicated by the fact that it headhunted a core group of people from Williams, and in retaliation, Gomez said, Williams basically sued everybody. That meant that Capcom, worried about falling afoul of the flow of lawsuits over even the most straightforward of pinball designs used at Williams, had to essentially reinvent everything from the flipper to the bumper. That slowed the development process of Capcom's initial tables and made the costs go through the roof, Gomez said. They had to turn on the money faucet, and they were spending a lot of money before they were going to get anything back, he said. While an established company like Williams could afford a misstep or two, Capcom Coin-Op, hemorrhaging cash from the get-go, had to make sure every one of its tables were hits. But nobody gets it right 100% of the time, Gomez said. Capcom closing didn't surprise me. I saw the games they were making and how they were struggling to sell them. I knew it was just a matter of time. But before it shut its doors, the company managed to create something that would become nearly mythical in pinball collecting circles. Big Bang Bar. And had it not been for Gene Cunningham, a Midwest octogenarian, warehouse mogul, and skating rink owner who became obsessed with not just buying the hard-to-find table, but recreating it, few outside the defunct company would ever have had a chance to play it. Unfortunately, the effort cost Cunningham dearly. Biker babes from Mars, Planet Mars, illustrations of aliens ripping astronauts apart in an underground extraterrestrial city. Before it was Big Bang Bar, the now legendary pinball table started out as a single concept that spurred a lot of very different ideas. The early overload of concepts was driven by the unique approach the game's lead designer Rob Morrison was taking for creating the game. Instead of developing and evolving the game on his own in the more traditional way of creating pinball machines, Morrison opened up the process to the entire team of people, like sound designer Jeff Powell and artist Stan Fukuoka. I did what seems like hundreds of comps, playing with different layouts and characters to make sure I did all I could to realize the game's potential, Fukuoka told me. His concept art seems to back that claim up. An early hand-drawn image shows a giant spiked monster looming over two men in spacesuits. Another shows a spacesuited man and woman being grabbed by aliens with massive heads. In a third, three women on hoverbikes fill the page with the words "Biker Babes from Mars" hovering above them. And finally, there's a shot of a space canteen packed with a mix of aliens drinking, playing future video games, and watching a dancer cavort in a liquid-filled tube. Fukuoka said that Morrison's original idea for a space-themed game was spurred by his creation of a mechanical arm that would lift and move the ball across the playfield, something he thought could drive a lot of attention to a machine placed in a bar. Eventually, the team settled on a space bar concept and set to work. The table was Morrison's first solo project, and also the first machine that Powell and Fukuoka worked on without the guiding hands of mentors or more experienced co-workers, something that seemed to help with the game's inspired design. When Powell came to Big Bang Bar, the game had just settled on its theme and mood, which was starting to take shape through Fukuoka's art. Where once he had focused on aliens and space babes, the new artwork centered on putting a player inside an outer space bar. The back glass picture, which faces anyone playing the game and is home to things like the display and score, shows a woman in red smiling directly out at the player, a pair of futuristic sunglasses pulled down from her eyes. Behind the woman is a scene of riotous drinking and cavorting, a barman who is all grinning teeth, and go-go dancers suspended in tubes. The whole scene is bathed in pastel blues and greens, a stark contrast from the blacks and reds of traditional pinball machines. Fukuoka said once the theme became a party in outer space, his vision began to come into focus. As the team worked through the designs, the table took shape. A punishingly hard pinball machine that is as fun to play as it is to watch others play. Rob had so many ideas that he couldn't incorporate everything into it, Powell said. He basically threw the kitchen sink at the machine. By June 1996, there were about 14 prototypes of the machine created, some of which were dropped in nearby locations for live testing. And the results were overwhelmingly positive. People seemed to love the game, but Capcom was growing increasingly impatient with the expensive pinball division. They wanted to make money on a blockbuster. In a fit of what some described to me as desperation, the company decided to push Big Bang Bar's release back, worried that a pinball table with a completely new science fiction IP wouldn't draw in the sort of audience that Capcom needed from its next table. Just before Big Bang Bar was ready to be manufactured, we had a bunch of German arcade owners come in, Powell said. They saw Flipper Football, which had a soccer theme and soccer scoring, and they went nuts over it. Capcom jumped at that and pushed it forward. They thought that it would be a hit in Europe and save the company. In November, Capcom brought both machines to the Chicago Pinball Expo, the largest gathering of new pinball machines in the world. Big Bang Bar pulled in crowds who stood in line for a chance to play the game. Flipper Football was mostly ignored. It was an obvious sign of what Capcom had to do to survive, but it came too late. So the company shipped Flipper Football into a void of hype. Less than a month later, Capcom shut down its Chicago pinball division, mothballing both the completed Big Bang Bar without shipping a single unit and the still in development Kingpin. The closing wasn't exactly a surprise to those at the studio, but there was a sense of desperate potential that perhaps if they had worked hard enough, fast enough, they could just get one more machine out the door. We had that thing finished and we were ready to go, Powell said. We had prototypes out in bars and arcades. The artwork was done, everything was done. It was a complete machine. I put a year of work into that, and then not to have it get out was just kind of crushingly frustrating. As the studio shut down, many of those working at Capcom purchased the surviving baker's dozen of Big Bang Bar machines, one was lost to a fire, at cost. It seemed that the future of the pinball table would be lost to a group of dedicated employees and their homes. But that changed 3 years later, thanks to Cunningham. In talking to those who knew Cunningham, befriended him, worked with him, or felt like they were betrayed by him, it becomes clear that they do all agree on one thing about Cunningham. With little experience, not a lot of help, and no likely chance of success, Cunningham promised the impossible and then delivered. But Cunningham's dream of recreating Big Bang Bar didn't go smoothly, not by a long shot. His first hurdle was significant. he needed Capcom, a Japanese-based company with a penchant for clinging to its properties and a long history in game development, to sell this real estate man and skating rink owner its rights to its pinball creations. It turns out that in 2000, that wasn't as big a challenge as everyone thought. "It wasn't like everyone was beating down the door to get this stuff," said Stern's George Gomez. "It was a deal that didn't hurt them, and eventually the rights were going to revert back to them." Gary Flower, pinball historian and author of Pinball: The Lure of the Silver Ball, said Capcom at the time had been quietly shopping around the remnants of its pinball business, which included rights and parts to its machines. Gene got wind that they were up for grabs and drove across the country to buy them, Flower said. While some believe Cunningham's interest was purely in Big Bang Bar, Flower and others say he had long wanted to get into the business of pinball creation with one of the then defunct companies. That included at the time Capcom, Williams, and Bally. Big Bang Bar just happened to be his first successful run. By 2004, 4 years after buying the rights to Capcom's pinball machines and Williams pinball parts, Cunningham was hitting up pinball expos, telling people they could buy into a future Big Bang Bar with a deposit down on what would be a $4,500 machine. Cunningham announced the remake in October at the 2004 Pinball Expo in Chicago during a wide-ranging talk about his company, Illinois Pinball, which up to then mostly sold parts to pinball owners. Ever the showman, Cunningham unveiled an original Big Bang Bar he purchased from a collector and announced that he would be creating and selling remakes. "There are going to be 111 machines made," he told the audience. "The first machine will be mine, the first 10 will be prototypes. Machine number 01 will be plated with pure gold, $2,000 worth of gold in the sidebars, legs, feet, bolts. It will sell for $12,000 and it's already spoken for. The rest of the first 10, he told the crowd, would each have a unique plaque with the number of the machine, the name of the original buyer, and a saying." He told the gathered enthusiasts that he wouldn't start the process until he had received at least 55 pre-orders. By the end of the 4-day show, 121 people had already registered to buy a machine. A month later, he sent out letters asking for a 50% deposit on the machines. Despite the interest and the deposits, there was a lot of doubt among the people who worked on the original machine at Capcom. "I heard through the grapevine that Gene Cunningham had bought up the parts," Jeff Powell said. "Everyone was skeptical. No one knew for sure if he had the rights to do it. But somehow he had gotten the dumpster drawings and everything. We were all skeptical. Is he really going to do it?" Mark Ritchie said he thought it was kind of crazy when he first heard about it. "I only thought a nut would do that," he said. "There's nothing easy about pinball, about producing them. It's a lot of work, tons of people, tons of time. How is that guy going to make this in some Illinois shithole?" It was true that Cunningham didn't have a plant for assembling the pinball machines, but he had plenty of warehouses sprinkled around Bloomington, including one next to his skating rink. The process of making a pinball machine typically requires an assembly line and workers with the skill and experience threading wires into bundled packs that then have to be crimped, tested, and eventually connected to the back of a playfield and the circuit board that runs the game. In the case of Big Bang Bar, Gene already had all the circuit boards and some parts, but he had to figure out the rest and then assemble it all. On top of the possibility of the whole thing falling apart, the asking price for the table was higher than usual. A new Stern pinball machine straight from the factory cost less than what Cunningham was asking. Despite the naysayers and the challenges, production got underway shortly after Cunningham collected the deposits. When June 2005 rolled around, the tables were still being assembled. Cunningham told his then roughly 180 investors that he needed the rest of the money, but that he also still didn't know when the machines would be done. As 2006 approached, some of those who had paid for a table began selling their pre-purchase to other collectors. Rumors began to swirl that the money was gone and the tables would never ship. And then they did. First, European buyers received their machines in a sort of last-minute rush. In July 2006, new legislation was going into place that would have made shipping the machines, which contained solder that included lead, into Europe impossible. Despite getting that first batch out just under the prohibition line, the rest of the owners didn't receive theirs until a year later in the summer of 2007. Big Bang Bar's launch day kicked off with a party at Cunningham's Illinois Pinball in Bloomington. Many of the people involved in creating the original game came out to chat with the new owners and autograph art or tables. There were balloons, a happy birthday banner, and even a cake. After the relative success of Big Bang Bar, Cunningham thought he'd give it another try. Over the next 6 years, Cunningham tried once more to bring a pinball table back from the dead. First, he tried with another unreleased Capcom classic, Kingpin, which, if you're familiar with this series, the last episode was about. Then, with a Williams title called Wizard Blocks, which was also mentioned in another episode. Neither came together, and in the spring of 2013, Cunningham filed for bankruptcy. His money, his pinballs, perhaps his legacy, lost in the convolutions of a contentious 3-year bankruptcy case. Cunningham says people came from all over the country to celebrate and pick up their pinball machines. They came to celebrate not just the launch of a pinball machine lost to time, but the achievement of what nearly everyone thought at one time was the impossible. Everyone, that is, except Cunningham. I had made my mind up that it was going to happen, he says. It cost me a lot of money, but I knew I could do it. Cunningham estimates he spent around $7,200 on each machine, selling them for the promised $4,500. It cost a lot more than that for a lot of them because, well, we made some special ones for some people. Gold trim, brass trim, sidebar, and legs. And in the case of my daughter's machine, which is probably the most valuable one, it's all done in metallic green, and all the employees and the guests that day signed it. It's got probably 500 or more signatures written under the boards inside the cabinet, he says. Despite the cost and loss of personal time, Cunningham says it was worth it. For the personal satisfaction, he says, it also gave me a good name around the business. Players of Big Bang Bar seem to universally enjoy Cunningham's recreation of the game, but not everyone involved shares the same feelings about Cunningham and what place, if any, he holds in the history of the game. Skate rink owner Overholzer, mentioned earlier in the article, and if you want to read the full article, it is available with a link in the description, described his former father figure as the sort of guy he'd still shake hands with, but then would stop and count his fingers. Gary Stern regards the pinball recreations as an accomplishment but nothing historical, and George Gomez describes Cunningham as a collector and a dreamer, though he sees the machine itself as not that big of a deal. Pinball designer Mark Ritchie says that Cunningham's impact on the pinball industry at a time when it appeared to be approaching death was significant. Gene Cunningham broke the ice for all these companies to sell directly into homes, Ritchie said. He did a huge favor to the industry. Pinball historian Gary Flower agrees. It's quite possible that if Gene hadn't set the ball rolling by doing the first ever remake, maybe the Medieval Madness table wouldn't have been made, he said. That's worthy of a mention. He should get credit for showing the pinball world you can go out and make pinball machines on a relatively small budget. Big Bang Bar looks like an amazing game. I've never had a chance to play one. I have seen it at places, but there's always a huge line to play it, so you never really get a chance. It's been at a couple of the different expos that I've been at and involved in. And I've just never gotten a chance to play it. I would love to get my hands on this bad boy one day. I have played the virtual version, but it's virtual pinball, so it's not the same thing. But it does give you a good idea what's going on. You can play it in virtual pin, VPX, I think, and Future Pinball possibly has one. It's out there. You can download it. Look at that dancing girl there, just doing her thing. Well, she's not really doing her thing, but she's there to do her thing. That's so cool looking. What an amazing machine. You guys, thank you so much for watching this episode of The Lost Pins. The series is going to come back in full force pretty regularly here. It's getting harder and harder to make some of these things. It's harder to find information about them, but we're going to do what we can. Thank y'all so much. Like, subscribe, and comment below. Have an awesome day. Captain.
Trying to bust my own.
The extra ball. Wanna throw some darts?
player one, where you been?
Son of a...
Sayonara. Hey, player one, my God, it really is you.
Yow! Whoa! One blow!
A little more to the right. A little more to the harder. A little more to the harder.
Oh, you trying to bust my balls here?
See the guys up there. See the guys upstairs. Do we gotta chase the waitress or what?
Where's the waitress? Bon voyage. Hey, player one, you're hanging around with these guys? Cut this guy off!
Upstairs.
Four with one blow!
Out with the trash. Hey, player one, is that your meter getting towed?
Nice shot!
Sayonara.